Welcome to the Trial Podcast, The Inquiry. I'm Caroline Cheetham.
And I'm Liz Hull.
We'll be back in a second.
Are your ulcerative colitis symptoms proving difficult to manage? Tremfya guselkumab can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. At 1 year, many patients taking Tremfya achieved clinical remission, and some patients also achieved endoscopic remission. Individual results may vary. Tremfya is a prescription medicine used to treat adults with moderately to severely active ulcerative colitis. Serious allergic reactions and increased risk of infections may occur. Before treatment, your doctor should check you for infections and TB. Tell your doctor if you have an infection, flu-like symptoms, or if you need a vaccine. Ask your doctor if Tremfya can help you manage the cycle of UC symptoms. Call 1-800-526-7736 to learn more, or visit tremfyaradio.com.
May 23rd, 1862. The soldiers of the 1st Maryland Infantry Regiment are on the lines, both of them. Though the blue and gray uniforms of the Confederacy and Union divide these men, they are all Marylanders, neighbors, colleagues, even brothers, fighting it out in a battle that perfectly captures the most poignant reality of a nation at war with itself. Join me, Don Wildman, on American History Hit as we return to the battlefields of the Civil War. Why did this war begin? How was it fought? And how did it all pan out? American History Hit, a podcast from History Hit. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
I make it absolutely clear that it's not for me as chair of this public
The decision
inquiry.
to move Letby to day shifts raises serious questions which we will be investigating. Was there a cover-up? If so, why?
I would pray for God to save her. He did. He saved
The
her.
convictions stand.
But the devil found her.
In August 2023, a neonatal nurse called Lucy Letby was convicted of killing and harming 13 babies in her care. She was sentenced to 14 life terms and declared one of the country's most prolific serial killers. A year later, she was convicted of attempting to kill another baby and given another life sentence.
All this happened in the Countess of Chester Hospital over the course of a year from 2015 to 2016. But what went wrong? Who knew what and when? How was a nurse able to kill and hurt babies on a ward under the noses of her colleagues?
The Thirlwall inquiry is now underway in Liverpool and will attempt to answer these questions and more. We'll be there covering events every day. So hi, thanks for joining us on this pretty emergency podcast, really. And we're here bringing you this emergency podcast because there's been a pretty huge development in this case. For once, though, this is not specifically about Lucy Letby. This is about the hospital, but more specifically, people who worked at the Countess of Chester. Now, lots of staff have given evidence and faced a lot of questions at the public inquiry since it began last September in order to give and help Lady Justice Thirlwall get to the bottom of what was happening behind the scenes, if you like, while Lucy Letby was attacking and killing babies on the neonatal unit. Now, we know that officers from Cheshire Police have been at the inquiry every day. And we knew that this was partly because they were conducting an investigation into the hospital for corporate manslaughter. Now, I'm just going to wind you back to the statement they gave us at the time about this. This is what it said. The investigation will focus on the indictment period for the charges for Lucy Letby from June 2015 to June 2016 and consider areas including senior leadership and decision-making to determine whether any criminality has taken place. At this stage, we are not investigating any individuals in relation to gross negligence manslaughter. The investigation is in the very early stages, and we are unable to go into any further details or answer specific questions at this time. So that was a statement we were sent by Cheshire Police in October 2023 when Lucy Letby had been convicted. They say, obviously, they're investigating corporate manslaughter. Today, Liz, that all changed, which is why we're here with this extra emergency episode.
Yeah, so essentially the police investigation has now been upgraded. The police were looking, as you said, Caroline, at whether the hospital, as an entity, as an organisation, if you like, could be held criminally responsible for the baby's deaths, which is effectively what corporate manslaughter means. But now that investigation today has been expanded. So what that means is they're also focusing on staff who worked at the hospital at the time, the individuals. And some of them are now being investigated, they've said, for gross negligence manslaughter. But what does that actually mean? Well, it means that some are now being investigated to see whether what they did or didn't do amounts to a crime. It also means that they could now potentially face being arrested and eventually prosecuted in connection with the baby's deaths.
So here's what Detective Superintendent Paul Hughes, who's a senior investigating officer for Operation Hummingbird, has had to say today in a statement that's just been released. In October 2023, following the lengthy trial and subsequent conviction of Lucy Letby, Cheshire Constabulary launched an investigation into corporate manslaughter at the Countess of Chester Hospital. This focused on senior leadership and their decision-making to determine whether any criminality has taken place concerning the response to the increased level of fatalities. As our inquiries have continued, the scope of the investigation has now widened to also include gross negligence manslaughter. This is a separate offence to corporate manslaughter and focuses on the grossly negligent action or inaction of individuals. It's important to note this does not impact on the convictions of Lucy Letby for multiple offences of murder and attempted murder. Paul Hughes also goes on to say that those identified as suspects have been notified. We will not be confirming the number of people involved or their identity, as no arrests or charges have yet been made. And it goes on to say both the corporate manslaughter and gross negligence manslaughter elements of the investigation are continuing, and there are no set timescales for these. Our investigation into the deaths and non-fatal collapses of babies at the neonatal units of both the Countess of Chester Hospital and the Liverpool Women's Hospital between the period of 2012 to 2016 is also ongoing. And Paul Hughes finishes by saying, our priority is to maintain the integrity of our ongoing investigations and to support the many families who are at the heart of these. There is a significant public interest in the reporting of these matters. However, every story that is published, statement made, or comment posted online that refers to the specific details of a live investigation can impede the course of justice and cause further distress to the families concerned. That is the end of the statement that we've just received from Cheshire Police. So just to explain a little bit about the law in all of this, and it is a little bit complicated, so worth bearing with us. Someone can be found guilty of gross negligence manslaughter if they have a duty of care towards the person who died, but they negligently breach that duty of care, and if at the time it was reasonably foreseeable that the breach would give rise to a serious and obvious risk of death. Obviously quite a lot of legal terminology in there. Now, the circumstances of the breach also have to be truly exceptionally bad and so reprehensible that it amounts to gross negligence. And the maximum sentence for gross negligence manslaughter is life in prison.
Yeah, so I did a bit of research on this, and while NHS trusts have been charged in the past with corporate manslaughter, none have actually ever been successfully prosecuted. There have been a handful of NHS staff, mainly doctors, who've been convicted and received suspended jail sentences for gross negligence manslaughter. This was where their failings have been found to have caused the death of a patient.
We'll take a quick break there.
So, to explain a little bit more about what the difference is between this corporate manslaughter and gross negligence manslaughter, we spoke to KC and the huge legal brain that's Mary Pryor.
Thank you, Mary. Good to have you back on the podcast again to walk us through some of the legal issues that we wanted to talk about, specifically about this time, though, about the hospital. I wonder whether it's worth just first of all talking through the differences in these two different charges.
Yes, Caroline. The definition of corporate manslaughter is that the thing that's being prosecuted here is an organisation. And in this case, it would be the National Health Service. Now, if the way that an organisation's activities are managed and organised causes a death, where there is a duty of care, clearly there's a duty of care, where that duty of care is breached in a way which is gross, so really significant, and that duty of care is owed by the organisation to the person that died, then that can be corporate manslaughter, provided the way something is managed is a substantial element of the breach of the duty of care, and that causes a death. The company can commit a crime, and that crime is corporate manslaughter. And if they do commit that crime, they receive a substantial fine, somewhere between 180,000 and many million pounds.
I mean, a fine in that region, Mary, could break something like the Countess of Chester, couldn't it? Who actually has the burden of paying a fine if it was to come to pass.
It would be that department.
They'd have to go to the Department of Health, surely, because one individual trust would just go under, wouldn't it, otherwise, if they were fined millions and millions?
The penalty could go up to £20 million. And it's right and fair to say that in some cases of corporate manslaughter, the fines that have been imposed have been so high that a company has folded.
Yeah.
And the judge who's imposed that fine has known it. Here, of course, any penalty that the National Health Service pays is simply taxpayers' money. And so it wouldn't of itself, in terms of a penalty, really create a difference. But if there is sufficient evidence, it would be a very good reminder for every other hospital, however tight finances are, they have duties that they must comply with, because this is a prime example of what goes wrong if they don't.
How does it become gross negligence manslaughter, and what does that mean? It's no longer the hospital that we're prosecuting, is that the case?
Yes, so corporate manslaughter deals with organisations. Gross negligence manslaughter deals with the individuals dealing with particular cases. And you would have to demonstrate a gross negligence manslaughter in relation to a particular individual and a particular deceased. Now, you can have more than one person accused of the manslaughter of a particular deceased.
It focuses on their individual decisions and how they went over the threshold of being so serious that culminated in a death.
Yes. So if, for example, you cannot demonstrate that this is a organisational breach of a duty, you then look at the individual people in any case and you say, has this individual in fact committed a crime? And so the first thing to say about gross negligence manslaughter is you don't have to set out to hurt anybody.
Yeah.
It doesn't have to be planned or sorted through. You've got to owe a duty of care to the person who dies. Obviously, nursing staff would owe a duty of care. Carers owe a duty of care. Teachers, that kind of person. You can see immediately who owes a duty of care. Parents are another one. Have you then breached that duty of care by either doing something or failing to do something?
Yeah.
And if you have, did that breach cause a death? In order for this to be a crime, it has to be not just negligent, but grossly negligent. Right. And the gross is an important word. It means exceptionally bad, reprehensible.
You have to be truly exceptionally bad at your job for them to make that link to you causing that death.
Yes. You have to be truly exceptionally bad as an individual. There's no intent to kill in gross negligence manslaughter. What there is a exceptionally bad failure to comply with your duty of care which provides a serious and obvious risk of death.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
It has to be death.
And as I said at the beginning, a lot of our listeners may not know this terminology, and that's because we don't see these cases in court very often.
No.
And is it fair to say, Mary, when they do go to court, the prosecutions don't necessarily succeed very often?
They don't succeed very often because of the very high threshold that is required before you have committed a crime in these situations. What is quite interesting is that a lot of people, because they've been listening to your podcast, because they've become interested in this particular trial, because it's noteworthy, are suddenly realizing that actually in our country, in our education system, we don't teach everyone the basics of criminal law. But what I can tell you is that up and down the country every week, there are people being tried for gross negligence manslaughter, not corporate manslaughter, but gross negligence manslaughter in all manner of cases. One case I prosecuted a few years ago was a father who'd taken his son to a very large water park, and his son, aged 5, was just left to wander around by himself. He couldn't swim and he drowned. Now that's gross negligence manslaughter. In other cases, you have people who have someone they live with who becomes very ill and they just don't get them any care. They literally watch them die. Now, in all these cases, there's complex medical evidence. But I'm satisfied that in most cases, juries understand it. The problem is that to have a real view on this case, you kind of have to do what you've done, Caroline, and you have done, Liz, which is to watch something from the beginning to the end.
Yeah.
Which is why you have this unique take on this case, because you've seen it from the beginning to the end, but each case would turn on its own facts. The failure that we have at the moment of any obligation to call out this kind of behaviour is something that the legislators will need to look at moving forward, because we don't, in this country, make it a crime to fail to act if you see something happening.
Right.
Where in other countries across the world, for example, if you saw someone drowning and didn't help, that could be an offence.
Right.
And it's something that I think we are going to have to look at, not just in medical negligence cases, but also in cases of child abuse, where people have perhaps known something's happened and not done anything about it. And it's too easy in cases like this to say a jury doesn't get it. A jury doesn't understand. My experience over 30 years now in criminal courts is that juries do understand, so long as we all have expertise within the courts. We need to have enough experts to do both sides, because otherwise there's always a risk of miscarriage of justice, isn't there, if we all rush to just have one conclusion. But here we have a situation where there are so few experts now that we really do struggle. And sometimes, you have to go overseas to get someone who is willing to produce a report, and we do need to work on that.
Mary Pryor, Casey, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thanks so much,
to give us your
Mary.
expertise. Much
Pleasure.
appreciated. Now, Cheshire Police won't say which staff or how many of them are at the centre of this investigation. And when this news broke today, actually, you and I, Liz, were in the middle of recording a special mini-series that we're publishing next week as part of the launch of our new podcast called The Trial Plus. Now, The Trial Plus is for members, so please do subscribe, as we'd love to keep building and growing our community. But the point of The Trial Plus is to go a bit beyond the trials that we're covering. And our first mini-series that we were literally recording today as this news broke was always going to focus on what was happening at the hospital between 2015 and 2016. And that's because we've got our hands on a report that was commissioned but never published. And that report explains and lays bare just how dysfunctional things had become, particularly in relation to governance at the Countess of Chester Hospital.
Yeah, so just to explain a little bit more, that when the police investigation into why babies were dying at the hospital was taking place, a parallel investigation was also taking place at the hospital itself. Now, this wasn't a police investigation. It was conducted by a specialist independent company that had been commissioned by Dr. Susan Gilby. She, you remember, took over from Tony Chambers as the chief executive. Now, the report took several years to complete, and like you said, Caroline, it's never been published, but we've seen it, and it is scathing of the management, of the committee structure, of the way decisions were taken or NHS guidelines misinterpreted, which meant that the deaths of babies weren't properly reported to hospital committees or outside bodies. We'll have much, much more on this next week, and we'll be releasing those special episodes after the Thirlwall inquiry closes on Tuesday.
So that's it for today for this emergency episode of the podcast. Don't forget, we'll be back on the usual trial feed from Liverpool, from the Thirlwall inquiry, as the barristers make their closing statements. And then on Wednesday, our special mini-series into the definitive story of what was happening at the Countess of Chester will launch on the Trial Plus. So to listen to the Trial Plus for ad-free listening and access to all of the trial archive, please go to thetrialplus.com. That's thetrialplus.com. Please do subscribe. That's open from Wednesday the 19th. That's Wednesday the 19th of March, which is next Wednesday, when we'll be also releasing our mini-series into what was happening at the Countess of Chester Hospital in 2015 and 2016.
In the meantime, you can follow us on TikTok at Daily Mail Crime, or you can email us thetrial@mailmetromedia.co.uk.
You can leave a comment on Spotify or send us a voice note on WhatsApp on 07796 657 512. Start your message with the word trial. We'll be answering your questions here on the Trial Plus.
See you then.